Hi, so this week we're going to be learning about the important role of your nervous system and exercise, fitness, and particularly sport. And though when people learn about muscle fiber type and training effects, that definitely changes in enzymes is important, glycolytic enzymes is important, change in mitochondrial content and enzymes is important, the ability to buffer for acids and lactic acid, all those things with regard to training are very important. And we learned you can change a tiny bit your muscle fiber type. And then some people seem to get really focused on muscle fiber type and the ability to predict success in an athletic event or perhaps even fitness goals by muscle fiber type. Ultimately, muscles, as you can see here, are being controlled by neurons. And without the stimulus from the neuron, there is no muscle contraction. And without your brain telling your spinal cord, telling your nerves to send signals to your muscles, all of this is irrelevant. So we don't want to get over focused on muscle fiber types and recognize they do have a role, particularly if you're interested in simple things like running, where you want to be a marathon runner or a sprinter. Well, of course, we have to still do all the training. But when you get into other sports, which most people are not marathon runners or sprinters, you have a lot more complicated things going on. And even sprinters really have to work on their starting gait and their ability to respond and get in the starting position when that gun goes off, that they're ready even before it's gone, right? And then we get into other sports, there's a lot of practice to have the body get into a really unusual position, do things that they would never do very quickly. We're talking lots and lots and lots of practice. And a lot of the practice isn't just for the muscle development, it's for the brain telling the body that we can do this. And the only way it can figure this out is from some type of practice. And then the question gets into often, what are you doing during your practice? And how do you recognize a play? And how do you respond quickly when the future is unpredictable? Where here you have a relatively stable environment that you can sort of practice for. Here you have some very unstable, unpredictable environments, and every day is different. So you start to learn to see patterns. And if any of you ever start reading the sports gene book, there is a particular chapter it talks about they can show tennis players or volleyball players a ball, like a picture like this for like a second, whether the ball was in or out, right? Or the person was in or out, or inbounds or outer bounds. And they can very quickly make an assessment, especially the better they are at the sport, that they show them this picture for a fraction of a second and they're more accurate than most people are. So all these things are really neural and sensory and not just about your fiber type. And so I would say most sports and goals and learning occur not at the muscular level, but at the neural level. So I'm going to go through some of these things relatively quickly. I want to keep this video relatively short, and I forgot to start my timer. Got it. That your nervous system, hopefully this is a review, has a brain, right? Your brain connects through your skull to your spinal cord. Your spinal cord is surrounded by backbones, vertebrae, and then coming out of the spinal cord, you have these things that we call nerves. And then the nerves connect to the muscles with regard to skeletal muscles. Very important for most sport also is your ability to sense the information goes in and you make an assessment on, depending on where your environment is, what to do and how to respond to that. We often see diagrams that divide the nervous system into central nervous system and peripheral. So the brain and the spinal cord are super important, right? There's the control center, and they're protected in hard bone, meaning your skull and your backbones, right? That protect your brain and your spinal cord, can't be injured. And then those come out of your spinal cord, out of the bones, and then connect to everything else, which we would call the periphery, which then we have sensory, right? Which we know what sensing is. And then motor means movement, right? We were really talking about moving things. You're either moving your guts, visceral means guts, moving your organs, or moving your body. So really the somatic motor division. And so this is from your textbook, if you have it, same thing, that you get this idea that there's this constant information flow back and forth, that you sense things, you see the ball, the sensing goes to your, or you feel the ball, that goes to your nerves, that goes to your spinal cord, your brain makes an assessment, tells you how to respond, sends a signal back out to your nerves, which tell your muscles what to do. And then also we have the voluntary system, we call this the somatic, soma means body, right? So the somatic nervous system that controls your muscles, your voluntary muscles, your skeletal muscles, and very relevant in exercise is also this division called the autonomic nervous system, which is involuntary. And we think about our fight or flight response. Our sympathetic nervous system is also a big part of the effects of exercise. And many people are exercising for health reasons. They're really trying to get the benefits of not just the muscles, but also those organs that if I start running up the stairs, all my organs are going to kick into a new gear, and that's going to make me ultimately healthier. And so here is, you often see these common diagrams dividing our body into sort of two different situations where we're relaxing, rest and digest, and when we're exercising or stressed, the sympathetic nervous system. And there on the side, you can see a picture of, obviously, this picture's not great. You have your brain and your spinal cord in the vertebrae, and then the peripheries, everything else to the sides. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the autonomic nervous system, your fight or flight system, because this is really when we think about not just your skeletal muscles, but everything else that is affected once you begin to exercise. This is also true for stress, and this is why stress and exercise have been often linked. But we will get back to this topic. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I really want to talk about neurons and how that neurons have electrical signals in them. In the next video, we'll talk about how those electrical signals occur inside our bodies and how they're active in our muscles, right? And we have the idea that there has to be some kind of stimulus that activates a neuron. And this even can link into things like drugs. And even if you think about them in the professional sporting event, the cheerleading or the fans making all the noise, right? And then we talk about how axons are parts of neurons have to send the signal, and that signal has to continue on to another cell. And this is sort of like this big chain reaction. So neurons are nerve cells, and I'll get to a nerve in a second. So a nerve cell is called a neuron, and there's different types depending on which way they send the information. Some are sensory, and they're also known as afferent. And it really helps if you can learn that word afferent. And some people just refer to them as afferents, meaning inbound neurons that are sending signals from your periphery into your spinal cord and your brain. And then the opposite is you have ones that are efferent or motor. They're going to tell your body to respond with some kind of muscle. It could be your heart, it could be smooth muscle, it could be skeletal muscle, or it could even be a gland. We call those efferents, afferents and efferents, kind of like affect and effect, which often sounds like just effect. And then located in your spinal cord, you have these connecting neurons in between them, not always, but often, called interneurons. And that makes sense because they're in between the sensory and motor neurons, or the afferents and efferents, and they connect them. So notice you can have, we often call a neuron signal an impulse, and that sends a signal to the spinal cord and the brain, depending, sometimes just the spinal cord, sometimes the spinal cord and then the brain. And this comes from all over your body. Right now you're getting all these signals, and then this brain and the spinal cord send out other signals, right? Depending on the situation. And notice a motor neuron can also talk to a gland, and glands do become very relevant during exercise, which we will get back to. And then interneurons are just connecting the two. So this is what neurons look like. We already know this. These are some images of different types of neurons. The top red and green ones are actually mouse neurons with some genetically modified proteins that makes them glow colors. The bottom is a computer-generated picture showing there's neurons and other types of cells surrounding them. And we've already seen this sort of cartoon idea of a neuron. And so neurons have three main parts. And the main parts are, and I guess you could, the cell body, where the decision-making is going on, right? Sort of like the master. And maybe in biology class, you'll learn the nucleus in there, but the whole, this is where the decision making is made. And then we have the receptors, which are like the antennae, which we call dendrites. And the word dendrite means like branch-like. They look kind of like tree branches. When people first saw them under the microscope, that's what they thought, right? And we call them projections. And so the signal, there could be some kind of stimulus, like you hear or see something, stimulates the neuron, travels to the cell body. Cell body makes a decision. Do I ignore it? Do I respond? Once it says yes, it sends that signal go down with electrical changes down this long skinny part, which we know is called the axon. And we get to the N, and terminal means the end. And notice you also have this green stuff surrounding the axon. The green stuff surrounding the axon is called myelin. Myelin sheaths is an important part reaction time, reaction speed, as well as the size of the neuron and muscle fiber types. It also relates to diseases relating to neuron diseases. And so there's these cells called Schwann cells that make this stuff called myelin. And myelin is an insulator, and fat's a good insulator. So fat's good for a cushion, but fat is also good to insulate heat. But in this case, it's insulating electricity the same way my wire for my headset right now is covered in a plastic insulator. And so Schwann cells make this stuff called myelin in the peripheral nervous system. That's the PNS. It's a different cell type in your brain and spinal cord. And so we often call, because of fibers, a long skinny thing, this is getting a little confusing. We have muscle cell fibers, but now the axons, because they're long and skinny, are called myelinated fibers. So now we're talking about nerve cells. So nerve cells can be fibers and muscle cells can be fibers. Depends on if you're talking to a muscle person or a nervous person. Confusing, that's how it goes. So if we look at this nerve cell here in the cartoon format, and here's the axon, it's surrounded by this red stuff in this picture, and that's the myelin. And here's a cross section, sort of. And what happens is there's the nucleus of the cell. Schwann cell sort of walks around it, walks around. It's not walking, but you get the idea. And it lays down the stuff called myelin, and they have this multiple layers. And if you cut this neuron like this, it'll look like this under a microscope. You see these layers of fat. So it's sort of been wrapped around in fat, the same way you might wear lots of layers of clothing if it's really cold out. And this keeps the electricity in the axon. We want that electricity to go the same way I want the electricity to travel from my headset to my computer so the signal can be maintained. And so this is an important part. Another important part about neurons in the peripheral nervous system out in my arms and my legs is if they get damaged, they can heal. And there's a connection between a lot of things, but some of it that Schwann cells and this have this thing called a neurolemma, which is the green part here, meaning the Schwann cells have this membrane where if you look at the myelin cells inside the brain and the spinal cord, they don't have this. And it's sort of a well-studied and not fully understood topic right now that when you injure a nerve cell in your peripheral nervous system, maybe you cut your finger one time really bad or your foot one time and you couldn't feel anything, it was sort of numb there for a while, but eventually it tends to grow back. Not always, often. Right? But we all know that if this injury occurs in your brain and your spinal cord, really you don't renew, you don't regenerate, and that's a permanent damage. So it's an area of much research and study for people who want to talk about paralysis and nerve damage. But this is also true when we think about differences in aging and diseases related to aging. So what the heck is a nerve? A nerve is just if you take those axons, the long skinny part of the nerve cell, and you put them in a bundle, just like when we looked at muscle cells, and that's why I wanted you to know the structure of a muscle cell. You have something very, very similar where you had an epimysium and a paramysium and so forth, an endomysium for muscle. Here we have an epineurium, so around the nerve cell, perimeter around the fibers. And you see it's a very similar structure. We also have a fasciculus, the same we had fasciculi and the muscle grouping. So a lot of the same words, epi, peri, endo. You have blood vessels just like in muscles, but now this long skinny things, instead of being muscle fibers and myofibrils, now we have axons, which are the long projection of a neuron. So notice the body sort of uses the same grouping, and then you have this connective tissue. And because wrapping around the axons you have myelin and fat, it looks white if you cut open an animal or a person, or if you look at a scan, it looks white. So we call that white matter because it looks white. And if you think of like fat and meat, right, it's usually that white color. And so the myelin is fat, so it looks white. So if we look at a person's brain or spinal cord, it's interesting, the brain and spinal cord are reversed. We often talk about the gray matter because it's sort of like a grayish color, and that doesn't have the myelin, thus the gray color. It's kind of pinkish, but pretty gray if you see a real brain. We had a real brain in my brain class last year, which was really cool. And then in the center, it's white. And so that tells you that there's a lot of myelin and axon in the middle. It's just anatomy of the body. And in the spinal cord is reversed, where the gray is in the center and the white's on the outside. So you have gray matter and white matter, and that makes up your brain and your spinal cord. And that has to do with where there's a lot of myelin and where there's not a lot of myelin. So this is a cross section of a spinal cord. And notice you have different types of nerves, and the nerves that are sensory and motor are not structured the same. And I just want you to be aware of this, because a lot of times when you take an exercise class, they assume the student has had some basic concepts of the idea that you have neurons that go inbound and you have neurons that go outbound. And then you can see if you had a really big nerve and you damaged this for some reason, you would lose both sensory and motor, sometimes people can still feel things and not move, right? And sometimes people can um, not feel. Did I just say that? The other way around. Sometimes people can't feel anything, but they can move. So it depends on which nerves get damaged, right? And so these are fairly big. And so sometimes you see athletes or people after a surgery or where they have nerve damage, right? Or you might have an inflamed